Chapter 26, in which Garland Lenox takes advantage of the beveled Christofle flatware used in Air France's first-class cabin. Actually, our terrible plan hadn't worked, but we had no way of knowing it at the time. We ate dinner with real knives and forks. I even tried caviar for the first and last time. Then the three of us indulged in hot fudge sundaes before the cabin lights dimmed. I suspected Garland and Parker would try to sleep, but the old man shouted for me to come sit on his ottoman. I obliged, and he said, "I thought you should know how I met Madeleine." "Who?" "Madeleine," Garland shouted, and a woman behind us turned on her reading lamp to see what was the matter. "The woman you're taking me to France to find. Holy hell, son, try and keep up." How was I supposed to know her name was Madeleine? You said she was French. I figured she had a French name, like Jacques or something. Jacques is a boy's name. Or whatever a French girl name is. Madeleine is a French girl name. Son, do you want to hear this story or not? I raised my hands in surrender and said, "Yes, tell it already. Wait, do you mind if I record you again?" "What the hell for?" "A lot of people liked your last story," I said, "and it really pissed off the Omaha Prophetic Presbyterians." Garland laughed. "Then by all means, son, record away." "Wait, do you think she'd want to hear?" Garland looked at Parker and said, "Don't wake her. She's heard all my stories a dozen times." Then he launched into his tale. "Now, I told you about that man in Chattanooga, signing me up for the Air Force 'cause I walked into the recruitment center with that mechanics boy. Well, I figured they'd try and make a mechanic out of me too, but somehow my paperwork got screwed up and they put me on a bus to something called the Aviation Cadet Classification Center in Nashville. The cigar-chomping officer I presented my papers to looked them over and said, 'Hell, son, they've lowered the requirements, but you still need a high school diploma to be here.' Of course, I didn't have a high school diploma because I'd spent most of my childhood in the damn woods waiting for doomsday, but I didn't mention that to him. I've always been able to read people. The day I met Elvis, I knew he'd sell 1 billion records and die on the toilet, and I knew that fat bastard in Nashville wanted to do as little work as possible. Sure enough, he started moaning about all the paperwork it would take to get me where I needed to be, so I said, 'Sir, there must be a mistake. I do have a high school diploma.' He glanced up and gave me a strange little smile, then scribbled something on my papers before handing them back to me and saying, 'You sure do. Right through that door, son. They'll show you where to go.'" A flight attendant walked by and Garland stopped her to ask for an extra pillow before continuing his story. "In Nashville, they shaved our heads and stuck us with 6 needles and tested us for a week to see if we'd be pilots, navigators, or bombardiers. Turns out I had 20/10 vision. Now, that didn't mean much to me. I just knew back home I could shoot a squirrel from 200 yards, but the Air Force seemed to think I'd make a good pilot. Hell, I'd never even driven a car, and they were about to let me fly an airplane. But first, we had 6 weeks of boot camp. We ran, and did push-ups, and ran, and scrubbed toilets, and ran, and peeled potatoes, and then we ran some more for good measure. The only thing I remember more than the running was the shouting. They'd shout at you if you messed up, and they'd shout at you if you did something right. I wanted to remind them I'd volunteered for this shit, and a little gratitude wouldn't hurt, but something told me that would only make them shout louder. After basic, we had 4 weeks of book learning on how planes work, the physics and math of it all. Then they tested us." "Hold up," I said. "If you never went to school, how did you manage to pass a physics test?" Garland laughed and said, "I cheated like the devil. I was just lucky the fella next to me knew what he was doing. Anyway, when they were through with us in Nashville, they loaded us on a train with blacked-out windows. None of us knew where the hell we were going, and one dumbass kept saying they were shipping us straight to Europe on a train. I don't think that poor boy realized there was an ocean in the way. Rest of us guys called him Choo Choo after that, at least until the Germans shot him down over Antwerp. We wound up in Texas, learning to fly rickety old Stearman 75s at a civilian-run flight school, then to Louisiana for basic flight, and finally to Selma for advanced flying school. When that was all over, they handed me my wings, told me I was a flight officer, and assigned me to the 375th Fighter Squadron in Richmond. I spent a few months in Virginia training in a P-47 Thunderbolt. Then in November, they stuffed a bunch of us on a big boat called the Queen Elizabeth and shipped us to England. Did you know some Hong Kong tycoon bought that boat in the 70s and tried to turn it into a floating university, but some Chinese nationalists set it on fire one night and it sank to the bottom of Hong Kong harbor? No, I didn't know that, I said, and tried to steer the conversation back to the war. So, you were a fighter pilot? With the aviator glasses and those cool leather jackets with the fur collars? I suppose I was, Garland said, though Badasham was usually a little too cloudy for the shades. And you spent the war what? Dogfighting the Luftwaffe? Hell no. I told you, son, I didn't do shit in the war. I flew escort for B-17s and that was it. We had permission to engage enemy fighters, but I never saw the first one. Did you fly on D-Day? I asked. No, son. My war didn't last that long, the old man said. He stared out his window for a long moment, then turned back to me and said, It was a few minutes after midnight on April 24th, and a fella named Joe Baggio and I were flying P-47 escorts for a flying fortress called the Savannah Smile, dropping leaflets over Normandy. Leaflets? Propaganda leaflets. Let everyone on the ground know the Germans were losing the war, and we'd be there to liberate them soon. Anyway, we were on our way back to Badasham when a German Focke-Wulf 190 came in from above and just lit us up. I was flying tail end Charlie, and he came at me first with those 20mm cannons, blew half my damn wing off, and I screamed into my radio, "Bogey at 4 o'clock," but I don't know who heard me. The Wolf went after Joe next, and it didn't take him long. Then he should have gone for the fortress. Those bombers were so bulky, a single fighter with a machine gun could take one down by itself. But for some reason, he came back for me. My plane was chewed up, and the cockpit was filling up with smoke when I saw that German coming back to get a medal for blowing me out of the sky. I needed to get out of that Thunderbolt fast, but I was taking on too much fire. If I'd tried to crawl over the side and jump out, bullets the size of your fist would have ripped me in two. So I got my seatbelt off, pulled the canopy back, and rolled that Thunderbolt hard as I could. When it was upside down, I just fell out toward France, and the Wolf never saw me. Bullshit, the eavesdropping man sitting behind Garland half said, half coughed, but thankfully the old man didn't hear him. That's insane, I said, and Garland waved me off and said, Don't be surprised at the lengths a man will go to save his own ass. The old man took a sip of water and continued, Now, I've been in some dicey situations before. The Shah of Iran once walked in on me playing chess with his favorite mistress, but I don't think I've ever been as scared as I was on that fall. Wait, can women not play chess in Iran? I asked. Strip chess, Garland said with a wink. But the thing was, you couldn't just jump out and pull your chute, because the Germans would strafe you into Swiss cheese if they saw you drifting to earth. So I fell, and prayed, and fell some more. You know that skydiving school out at Riverton Airport? Yeah, I said. The craziest fellas out there will sometimes deploy around 2,000 feet, but that's about as low as they'll go. But even 2,000 feet was too high for my comfort, so I waited and watched the ground get bigger and bigger. I've got no way of knowing how low I got, but I do recall the distinct smell of cow shit just before I grabbed the ripcord ring and pulled. Bullshit, The man behind Garland coughed again, but this time the old man jumped from his seat, grabbed the eavesdropper by his hair, and held a dinner fork to his neck. Not bullshit, cow shit, Garland said. Had it been a bull, I wouldn't have made it out of the field alive. Now I appreciate your interest in my story, but if you want to hear the rest, you'll have to watch it on the YouTube like everyone else. Because if I even suspect you're listening to us again, I'm gonna pop that emergency door and toss your ass in the ocean. Oh, thank you, Dollface. The flight attendant was back with Garland's pillow, and her eyes drifted from us to the terrified man checking his neck for blood. Is everything okay? She asked. I think the three of us could all use another hot fudge sundae, Garland said. Of course, the flight attendant said, but I need to ask that you return to your seat. Turbulence can occur unexpectedly, and for your safety, and... She glanced back at the bullshit man who was still rubbing his neck. For the safety of your fellow passengers, we ask that you remain seated with your seatbelt securely fastened whenever possible. Sure thing, Garland said, and handed her his fork. Then he gave the bullshit man a little slap on the cheek and said, Now you enjoy your sundae, before turning to me and saying with a wink, To be continued.